One of my favorite things about a new season is the sweet new potential loot that's going to be available for all classes. Obviously, with a new expansion, there's a plethora of new loot, and in the past, that normally diminishes after the first season because the only new content we really ever get is a new raid. This time though, we're seeing a whole new dungeon pool on top of a new reward system, and of course, crafting does still exist. So join me as we take a walk down memory lane with some of the returning dungeons and the loot it holds, as well as some of the benched Dragonflight Dungeons that are going to be available in Season 2. Let's dive in. Almost everyone is excited to see the return of Freehold. It was easily the most beloved dungeon for Mythic Plus of all time. Besides the dungeon being enjoyable, there was actually a pretty outstanding stat stick trinket from Harlan's collection. Ignoring the mounds of gold, players often sought after Harlan's loaded dice. This agility trinket has your attacks having a chance to grant you a random combination of secondary stats, including haste, mastery, and critical strike. For a trinket that simply gives you stats, this was by far one of the best options for agility classes looking for a passive damage increase. I'm not sure how much it will hold up against some of the new raid trinkets along with crafted trinkets, but for anyone who doesn't really raid, just be glad to see such a powerful trinket from such an amazing dungeon. Sticking with the Battle for Azeroth theme, we're also getting the opportunity to fight through the Underrot dungeon again. Unlike Freehold though, this places a few more interesting gear options. Outside of your random cloak and belt though, any fist weapon wielder will get the chance to gear up with the bile-stained Krog Tusk. Similar to Strike Twice or Storm Slash from the Naku Defensive, or even Poxstorm from Plaguefall back in Shadowlands, the Krog Tusk has a unique equip effect that causes your attacks to apply a damage over time effect to your target, dealing nature damage. While it doesn't have any secondary stats, depending on how well this effect scales, it will definitely be worth chasing. Another great item from this dungeon as well is the Vial of Animated Blood. While being a mastery stat stick, this trinket also has a 90-second cooldown on use. When it's used, it grants the user an insane amount of strength which will decay over 18 seconds. I can imagine that DPS warriors might be drooling over this trinket next season, and it might compete with a chance to be best in slot. Let's take a step back one expansion, to Legion. Neltharion's Lair is making its return and has a bunch of little trinket goodies hidden inside. Now, unlike Battle for Azeroth, I didn't play much of Legion, and the little that I did I was an Elemental Shaman main, so I don't recall any of these trinkets being sought after. I started playing Legion during 7.3, and back then I was pretty casual, but with trinkets from the raid being so powerful, especially with the role-specific trinkets like Ienar's Compassion and Norgannon's Prowess, there wasn't really a reason to look elsewhere. Tanks might be fairly pleased with the trinket pool from Neltharion's Lair though. Shard of Rockmora encases your body in crystal, absorbing a portion of each attack against you up to a certain threshold. Those numbers though will scale with the item level of the trinket. I personally can't see it being that great outside of specific scenarios. With it being a 2-minute cooldown as well, I just think there's better defensive trinkets out there, like the Talisman of the Cragshaper. While it doesn't provide much in terms of main stat, that hasn't stopped tanks in the past. This trinket reminds me a lot of Psychic Shell from N'Zoth. It's on a very short 1-minute cooldown, and it prevents 50% of all the damage you take for 15 seconds. There is a limit to how much it can absorb though, basically until you break the absorption shield, but remember that during that time you're going to have a 50% damage reduction. There are 2 DPS trinkets from this dungeon as well, one for range DPS called Narax's Spiked Tongue, and one for melee DPS called Mark of Dargrul. The Mark of Dargrul causes melee attacks to trigger a landslide, dealing damage to enemies directly in front of you. While this seems pretty dope, I can't help but think that it won't hold up to some of the other trinkets available in other dungeons. I am super stoked for the Vortex Pinnacle making a return. But when glancing at the dungeon journal, I can't help but think that this dungeon will simply be for IO, or for very specific classes who need certain secondary stats and items. Even on PTR currently, the mythic table isn't updated, so it's hard to tell what's going to be available and what is not. Similar to some of the Warlords of Draenor dungeons, the jewelry items have main stat on them, which isn't currently in Blizzard's design philosophy, so those will either be removed or reworked. Oddly enough, there are a handful of items like pants and gloves that have prismatic gem sockets on them. It would be really cool if those were left in, but I can only imagine that they're going to be removed as well, which will severely limit the gear that's going to drop from this instance. Realistically, only time will tell, and if anything cool crops up on the PTR, I will try to update all of you. Moving on to the new Dragonflight Dungeons. I'm sure that these items will be a little more well known, but I'm going to walk through these items a little bit faster. In Halls of Infusion, there is a super sick trinket called Iridius Fragment. This trinket is stupid nuts because it gives the user a hefty amount of main stat that will diminish every time they cast a spell. More than likely, Arcane Mages, Boomkins, and maybe even Arms Warriors might enjoy having this fragment. Personally though, Neltharis will be my favorite dungeon. I loved running this dungeon both on beta and during the early days of the expansion. I'm really looking forward to fighting against the Dejarin, especially when rare items like Forge Storm are potential rewards. This insanely sick weapon is for any melee mace wielder. While not providing anything in terms of main stat, your attacks have a chance to cause AoE fire damage to erupt. Back on beta, these typically ended up being 2 to 4% of my damage as a Brewmaster monk. It's just a shame that we're no longer going to have Seal of Daruna's Chosen to accompany the free fire damage. I'm hoping when it comes to Brackenhide Hollow that Blizzard tunes this dungeon properly. I think many tank players will be farming this place due to Treemouth's Festering Splinter. This powerful trinket will deal nature damage to the user, but in return it'll grant a 50% damage reduction for a pretty sizable amount of time. This is almost identical to Talisman of the Cragshaper from Neltharion's Lair. Tanks, especially the squishier ones, will enjoy having the additional damage reduction like this in the form of a trinket. Last but not least, we have Olamon, Legacy of Tyr. This instance has the chance to drop a few very unique trinkets. Time Breaching Talon provides the user with a Kiss Curse effect, where you steal a massive amount of intellect from your future self for 20 seconds, but then you lose a fraction of that intellect for 20 seconds after. With the trinket being on a 2.5 minute cooldown, it might be pretty odd for some classes to use, but who knows? Not me, that's for sure. The tank trinket though is what I'm most excited for from this dungeon in particular, which is called the Inexorable Resonator. This trinket acts as a pseudo cheat death trinket, kinda. Basically, when you dip below 50% health, the trinket will activate for 12 seconds, resulting in a high chance to counter attacks for a large chunk of fire damage, and absorbing a portion of the damage that you take. During my beta testing days, this trinket felt best on Blood Death Knight or Vengeance Demon Hunter, since they often dip below 50% health, but realistically isn't a bad choice for any tank who is looking to bolster their defenses. Gear and the gearing process itself is extremely murky now, especially with the rotating dungeon pools, new raid loot, invasion gear, PvP, inspiration catalyst, and crafting. Without being able to test anything yet, I have no idea if any of these items will be best for any class in particular. I'll leave that to the sim lords though, but as soon as these items are available on the 10.1 PTR for testing, you better believe I'll be punishing some of those training dummies. Anyways, if you enjoyed this little analysis, do me a favor and hit that like button. It does a lot to help out the channel. Huge shout out to my Patreon supporters, because without them, there'd be much less of, well, whatever this was. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.